Hello, welcome to our celebration of World Soil Health Day, when we focus our attention on how our soil influences our brain health. Here today, we will have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Bonnie KAPLAN, Professor Emerita of the University of Calgary and co-author along with Julia Ruckledge of The Better Brain. We, as the composters of Canada, are really focused, along with our colleagues around the world, of being Mother Nature's recyclers, taking the organic residuals from our foods, from our gardens, from our agricultural and other places where organic residuals lie, and not putting them into the landfill, but rather transforming them through organics recycling into the valuable organic matter that is essential to get back to our soils, to continue life as we know it on our planet, to feed the soil, the microorganisms, as well as make our world go round. And so as we recognize our work, there are linkages. We're not in a silo. There are linkages on so many fronts in terms of the work that we're doing in terms of climate change mitigation, in terms of water conservation, wise use of resources, and now that direct link in terms of making sure that we feel better, we do better through better health. Dr. Bonnie KAPLAN is a research psychologist, Professor Emerita at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. During her 40-year scientific career, she has published widely on the biological basis of developmental disorders and mental health, particularly focusing on the contribution of nutrition to brain development and brain function. In recent years, her work has been recognized, being the recipient of the Dr. Rogers Prize for career contributions to complementary and alternative medicine in 2019, being recognized as one of the key difference makers in Canada in the area of mental health in 2017, and most recently co-authoring the book along with Dr. Ruckledge, The Better Brain. I think it says volumes in terms of one of the introductions of this book, in terms of the question that was asked: what if the key to treating mental illness can't be found at the pharmacy, but lies in the very foods and nutrients we eat? Dr. KAPLAN has dedicated her life, and now we have the privilege to listen to her and learn from her, and then act as we need to do to move our worlds forward. Dr. KAPLAN.
Thank you, Susan, for that lovely introduction, and welcome to everyone who you probably know a lot more about soil than I do, but I'd like to talk to you about the importance of it in terms of human brain health. The most important thing on my title slide is probably my website. Since I cannot cover everything here, feel free to go to bonniejkaplan.com. There are lots of recordings there and other resources too. This is a disclosure slide. It's conventional in my world to always have one, just to indicate that I have no commercial interest in any company or the sale of any product. I do, of course, have an interest in talking about our book, because that's how we want to manage to finally raise awareness of the role of nutrition in terms of brain health. My message today is very simple. What is done in the world of agriculture is very important for the health of our brains. It's also very important for our public budgets for the treatment of brain health problems, and I'll mention a few things in relationship to that later on. I want to go back to the year 1910, which, if you're very young, might sound like ancient history, but for me, it just happens to be the year my father was born, so it doesn't feel very old at all. People who were homesteading in the American and Canadian West at that time had left all of the sources of practical knowledge, their families who would teach them how to run a household and how to raise children, their veterinarian sources of information, their medical sources of information. And so the People's Home Library that was published in 1910 was very important for helping people live more independently on their own and take care of the problems that would arise. And if you look at the index of the People's Home Library and ask the question, well, what did they do for mental health problems? It's really very interesting. The number one cause of, or they called it acquired insanity, was said to be imperfect nutrition. I think that they were quite right. It's not the only cause of mental health problems, but it certainly is a major one, and it's the one which is being neglected. So let's talk a little bit about where those nutrients come from. You probably recognize this FAO chart that has been around since 2015. It's a lovely display of the role of nutrients and minerals in particular in our soil, about how they function in our crops to create nutritious food, and then how those nutrients are relevant to our human health. But although it does make this important point that soil is the foundation of nutrition, it is a little light on the role of nutrition in brain function. So I hope to correct that, or I should say elaborate on it as we speak today. Basically, they talk about iron and zinc, or display that in the slide, and I'm going to be showing you that there are probably at least 30 micronutrients, minerals, and vitamins, plus all the amino acids and essential fatty acids, which play roles in our brain health. It's been known for quite a while that mineral depletion is having an effect on the nutrient density of our food. This is from Thomas, published in 2003. It's a review of 27 kinds of vegetables and 10 kinds of meat, showing mineral depletion from 1940 to 1991. Let's just focus on the vegetables for a moment. Copper declined in those 50 years by 76%, calcium by 46%, iron, magnesium, potassium, etc. This is of great concern for human mental health. There is a lot of positive hope. Many of you listening to this are people who are working to improve that situation. And the people who asked me to give this talk, the Compost Council of Canada, are also showing that what they're doing is having a beneficial impact. So you probably recognize these 5 steps, again provided by FAO a number of years ago, and this is how the Canadian Compost Council has put it into a graphic that they display. But I want to focus on a study that the Compost Council of Canada sponsored with scientists at Dalhousie University in Canada. This study was carried out in Brandon, Manitoba. This next slide describes it a bit. The CQA is a voluntary program created by the Compost Council of Canada in collaboration with compost producers to utilize standardized testing methodologies. This is important for improving the soil. It's also important for research, such as the study I'm about to show you, to be able to have standardized methods and operating protocols so that people can compare information. The Brandon, Manitoba study assessed the effect of a 5-year variable frequency of municipal solid waste compost on metabolic profiles in these 4 vegetable crops: lettuce, beets, carrots, and green beans. Basically, they had 3, the vegetables were assigned to one of 3 treatments, one of which was the control, meaning no compost, but the other 2 were annual compost application versus biennial compost application. And just, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. I'm going to show you some data also, but it's very interesting just to look at the effect of the compost on annual application, the larger vegetables in all 3 cases. Biennial was next, and the control condition was the lowest. But what does that mean unless you look at some of the data? This is the yield data showing the 4 quadrants are carrots, lettuce, green beans, and beets. And the 3 bars are, the one on the far left is annual application of MSW compost, the middle one is biennial, and the third is the control frequency. And what you can see is the yield was greatest with annual compost. More importantly, from my perspective, it's not just the quantity of the vegetables, but the nutrient density. And this graph it's a little busy, but it shows you again with lettuce, carrots, green beans, and beets in the 4 quadrants. It shows the, 9 essential amino acid metabolites in the crops that were grown. And what the blue bar is annual application of the MSW compost. The second kind of brighter red bar is the biennial, and the dark red going to black is the absence of compost. So it's fairly convincing data at several levels that composting is one of the good things to be doing and a hope on the horizon for improving our nutrient availability for our brains. So it's time now to talk about brain health. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the prevalence rate of mental disorders and how it is skyrocketing, so I thought I'd show you a couple slides on that. When I was in school in the 1950s and 60s, it was assumed that 1 to 3% of the public would be reporting difficulty with their mental health. Now it's 20%. And the World Health Organization says that the lifetime prevalence is 50%. That means that 1 out of every 2 of us will be diagnosed with a mental disorder at some point during their life. I don't know about you, but I think that that's just a shocking statistic. This shows you the same thing in graphic form. And if anyone's interested, I can give you the sources and references for each data point. But the point is that something's going on, and we know that it's probably lots of things, but certainly nutrition is. Okay, let's talk about our brains. Our brains are very, very small, only about 1 kilogram, regardless of the size of your body. And so they account for about 2% of our body weight, but they represent 20 to 50% of our metabolic demands. I call it the greedy organ. So when you are breathing and when you are eating, it is mostly to provide what is needed for your brain. Some people find it interesting. Some people find it interesting to think of this in terms of the amount of blood inside of us. So each of us as adults has 4 to 6 liters of blood inside of us, circulating all over brain and body. And about 1 liter, so 1/6 to 1/4 of our blood supply, is perfusing our brain every single minute that we are alive. So that tiny little 1 kilogram organ is sucking up about 1/6 to 1/4 of our blood and everything in the blood every 60 seconds that our heart is beating. And what is it carrying? Well, of course, it's more than just a story about nutrition. Our blood supply provides oxygen, it takes away waste products, etc. But we're focusing on the nutrition side of it today. So you have to ask the question, why have we evolved to need so many nutrients every minute? And it all boils down to metabolism, which is simply the transformation of one compound to another. Some of this is taught in school. We learn that chemical A gets converted to chemical B with an enzymatic pathway. But what doesn't seem to get taught in schools yet, although some of us think this should change, is that enzymes do not function optimally without the cofactors, which are mostly minerals and vitamins, to enable them to do their work. So for optimal brain metabolism, you need to be perfusing your brain at all times with minerals and vitamins to optimize enzymatic activity. A lot of people are not aware of the fact that we cannot eat the neurotransmitters that our brain needs. I've asked audiences this question. Where do you get the serotonin? Everybody's heard of serotonin. Everybody's heard of dopamine. What are you eating to provide the serotonin and the dopamine for your brain? Well, you can't eat serotonin. You can't eat dopamine. Fortunately, our brains are capable of producing it only if we give our brains what they need to do that synthesis. So I'm going to show you in this next slide one example of that. So this is a picture of a very tiny corner of brain metabolism, which involves the tryptophan metabolism and synthesis of serotonin. Tryptophan, serotonin, and melatonin are in red simply because most people recognize those names, and the others are in black. But it's terribly oversimplified to make a point, and that is the role of micronutrients, by which I mean minerals and vitamins, in all the enzymatic reactions. So the important part of this slide are the arrows. The arrows represent enzymatic reactions, and as you step through, you can see tryptophan to 5-hydroxyl-tryptophan requires iron, phosphorus, and calcium. Without sufficient iron, phosphorus, and calcium, that pathway will be sluggish. The next one above that shows the importance of vitamin B6. That's the cofactor which is required for optimal function of that step. Over on the left, B6, riboflavin, and iron. And I'm just going to step through the others. You'll see a lot of B vitamins, trace minerals, zinc, which is of course ubiquitous in the brain, iron and niacin, vitamins and minerals in every step. And so in this almost cartoon simplification of what is required in the synthesis of and breakdown of serotonin, the various byproducts, we have over a dozen minerals and vitamins, and they have to be there for optimal function if you want to have those neurotransmitters and metabolites functioning in your brain. I could show you similar diagrams for dopamine and other neurotransmitters. I could also show you a similar one for ATP production, which happens in every cell in our body. Mitochondria need a whole host of a dozen or more micronutrients to produce ATP in an efficient way so that we have enough of that energy molecule throughout our brain and body. But I'm going to go on now. I think I've made the point. I want to kind of summarize where we are right now. So, two of many problems for our society. What we've been talking about so far is that without adequate minerals and a healthy soil microbiome, and I haven't talked about fungi and all the things that you folks know about better than I do, but we know that plants are not going to be able to synthesize the vitamins we need, and so in order to have the vitamins and minerals in our diet, it all begins in the soil. And the one study that I showed you indicated one of the hopes for the future is that compost can really contribute to the health of our soil. But the second major problem in our society is that we are not making good choices when we decide what to put in our mouths. And this is another topic that has to be part of educating the public. So let me show you some really appalling data. This, of course, is a whole foods diet. Some might call it a Mediterranean style diet. This is what we should be putting in our mouths, with lots of nuts and seeds and vegetables and fruits, etc., and whole grains. And this is what our society is choosing to consume. A while ago, I discovered that about half of the caloric intake of all Canadians was from that slide of ultra-processed food. I was really quite shocked at that, and I'll show you why in a moment. But more recently, just in the last couple of months, I've discovered that the situation is even worse than we thought. This is from N. Haynes, which is a long-running method of evaluating American food intake and nutritional health. N. Haynes stands for National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and it's been going on since 1971. These two statistics have just been published in the last couple of months in major medical journals. The first was a presentation of what was happening in our children, aged 2 to 19 years. 2/3 of the caloric intake of our kids aged 2 to 19 comes from ultra-processed products. And then the next month, a different group also studying NHANES data reported that in adults, 57% of our food intake was from ultra-processed products. Why do I find that so shocking? Here's why. We already know that nutrition is the foundation of our physical and mental resilience. So let's ask this question. What happens to people whose nutrient intake is 50% of what it could or should be? Well, it turns out we don't have to ask the question because we found out from research that is 70 years old. This is a report from the University of Minnesota starvation experiments, which were conducted after World War II, when there was a lot of interest in trying to find out what happened to the people who went through the Dutch hunger winter and people who were liberated from the camps, etc. So they took a group of 36 normal, healthy men, and they put them on, for 6 months, they put them on a diet that was 50% of their normal caloric and nutrient intake. Now, this is not exactly analogous to what's happening right now in our society because, of course, our societies are not cutting their caloric intake, but they are cutting their nutrient intake. And so we have obese people who have almost three quarters of our society now is overweight or obese. So these people showed all the symptoms of depression, anxiety, and even some of ADHD. Some of the words are a little old-fashioned, like hysteria, but it is a description of mental illness caused by cutting nutrient intake by 50%. So let me explain a few things about this slide. First of all, it has been shown abundantly in many, many countries that people who make poor food choices, meaning eating mostly processed food instead of whole foods, are reporting much more depression and anxiety. But correlational studies like that, I'm not going to cover any of them. They come from all over the place, all ages, and they all show the same thing. Correlational studies can't tell us what is the cause. I mean, are people depressed because they're making poor food choices, or are they making poor food choices when they're depressed? As I always say, I've never met a depressed person who craved broccoli. In order to really address the issue of causality, we need prospective studies. And fortunately, now we have a number of them. I'm going to show you just one that was reported in children, and it shows very clearly the direction of causality. Now, what do I mean by a prospective study? A prospective study takes a group of people, evaluates their dietary patterns and their mental health, and then uses that information to see if they can predict who will be vulnerable a few years later to having a mental health problem. And the answer is yes, which is a very powerful statement, is it not? So this particular study was published in Pediatrics a year and a half ago. It was done in Canada and in about 3,000 children aged 10 to 11. And the reason I'm showing you this is that I am very concerned about what we are doing to our children. Even when we still have control of what they are eating, we are not providing them with a whole foods diet, apparently. So the children were divided according to how many of 9 health recommendations they fulfilled. Not all 9 were on diet. 6 of the 9 were on diet, and you can guess what they were. Things like eating whole foods or drinking sugary drinks, etc. The other 3 were on screen time and physical activity, but I'm going to focus on the food part. And then they came back 3 years later and asked the question from the administrative health data, could they predict who in that time period was referred to a physician for diagnosis and treatment of a mental health problem? And the answer was yes. So what this shows is with those 6 dietary recommendations that they used at baseline, those who met only 1 to 2 of them, they set them at a kind of an arbitrary level, and they asked how much of a risk reduction could they find in people who were more vigilant about their diets. And so they met 3 to 4 recommendations or 5 to 6 recommendations. And as you can see, there was a significant risk reduction in those who met more of the dietary recommendations in the guidelines. Then they did something very interesting. They did a multiple regression analysis where they determined that for every additional recommendation that was met, there were 15% fewer physician visits for mental disorders. And I put the dollar signs in here because in other research, this team has shown the impact on the healthcare dollar of trying to get people to improve their dietary intake. Is it also important to consider nutrients in pill form, not just dietary patterns? Well, yes, there are a number of reasons. There are people who already eat a really healthy whole foods diet, and yet they still improve when they're given nutrients in pill form. So this is an important slide for those of you who are familiar with the issues in the soil. A good diet might not be sufficient for optimal brain function. There are lots of reasons. The first one is that there are individual differences. We are born with different needs for different cofactors for optimal enzymatic activity. There are about 50 of them that have been documented for physical health. We don't have that kind of level of detail yet for brain health, but someday we will. Second reason is currently there's no test of what an individual brain needs for optimal function. No one can tell you what you need, whether you're getting enough magnesium relative to what your brain needs. No one can tell me whether I'm getting enough vitamin B6 relative to what my brain needs. In other words, that language that they used back in 1910 about imperfect nutrition, what is imperfect for you might differ from what is imperfect for me. But the third reason a good diet might not be sufficient for optimal brain function really comes back to the soil, which affects us all. Now, I need to just briefly tell you about the kinds of research using nutrients in pill form. I sometimes call them supplements, sometimes I don't, but you know that that's what I'm talking about. There are so many studies worldwide, and the media does not cover them. In fact, in over 20 years of research in this area myself, and knowing about all of these studies, which we review in our book for the general public, I have seen the media cover only one. And it's amazing to me, but somehow one of them captured the media's attention, whereas otherwise the media is not interested in studies of nutrient supplements unless they're negative. There's a great interest in showing that vitamin D is not going to cure all of depression. Well, anybody who knows about the brain metabolic pathways wouldn't expect a single nutrient to solve something like depression or anxiety. At any rate, I've categorized the studies on this slide for you. There are still lots of studies being done on single nutrients like vitamin D, and really I just tell people to ignore them. They shouldn't be funded, they shouldn't be conducted. There are no single magic bullets for brain health. I'm not saying that people shouldn't study what vitamin D does, for example. That's very important to know. But if we are looking at clinical trials, trying to improve brain health, the idea that a single nutrient is going to solve a brain problem is ludicrous to me. And my colleagues and I have written a paper elsewhere on the magic bullet theory. We all want to think that there is some magical single ingredient that's going to solve brain health, just the way vitamin C, for example, prevents and cures scurvy. But the brain is just much more complicated. The second category, I call it the favorite few, because the investigators usually know something about a few nutrients and they decide to study them and somehow get funding for their favorite few, and generally they are not very effective in solving anything in terms of mental health. Now there is an exception, and that is B vitamins are very, very important in the brain, and there is a solid body of literature showing that for people who do not have a mental disorder, okay, general public, but who are going through a tough time, say exams in university or stress at work or a pandemic, that just taking a daily B complex does improve their resilience somewhat. There is absolutely no evidence that B complex alone will have any significant benefit for a mental health problem. For that, you need to look at the literature on broad spectrum formulas. And that is providing roughly 30 minerals and vitamins, what we should be getting from our food, in a broad spectrum formula. So my next slide summarizes the broad spectrum research, which does show benefit in mental health disorders. So this is my co-author, Julia Ruckledge, who's on the faculty at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, put together this summary slide quite recently. These are all of the placebo-controlled randomized trials using a broad-spectrum multi-nutrient formula in samples of people with diagnosed mental disorders. And you can see that the disorders vary from aggression to stress to ADHD, etc. Now, stress, I shouldn't have highlighted that one because that's where B complex is different. That's not really a diagnosed mental disorder, but addiction, ADHD, etc. And what these numbers say is that in 45 of the 55 placebo-controlled clinical trials, 82% of them show positive benefit. What is more interesting from this slide is what is in the yellow highlighted line down here. Because regardless of what the diagnosis is, aggression, ADHD, addiction maybe is a little different, depression, anxiety, it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. All of the laboratories in all of the countries in the world who have studied the broad spectrum formulas find that the symptoms which improve the most readily, the easiest, the fastest, the most thoroughly, are in the area of emotion regulation. We see lowered irritability, fewer violent outbursts, greater ability to manage one's emotions. It's just a universal finding across all ages also. So I'm going to show you one set of studies next. This is in children. It's the Maddie trial, and one of the reasons I'm highlighting it is that it was published after our book was published, so it's not covered in our book. Another reason is that I have, since retirement, been raising quite a lot of money to support research of my junior colleagues, and this is one of the trials that I was able to help kickstart with donors providing money to my charitable funds. So this is a replication and extension of previous blinded, randomized controlled trials in children with ADHD that Julia Ruckledge has reported on, and which we do cover in the book. This is the micronutrients in ADD youth trial called Maddie, and the principal investigator is at Oregon Health and Science University, Dr. Jenny Johnstone. It's a multi-center trial. The other two centers were Ohio State University in the U.S. and the University of Lethbridge in Canada. They selected children who were not medicated but were aged 6 to 12 years of age, and they gave them a broad spectrum micronutrient formula and showed significant behavioral improvement. The micronutrient group, 54%, were in the much to very much improved range, and only 18% of the placebo group. And the other thing when they broke the blind that really was kind of amazing to see was that in just 8 weeks, the children in the micronutrient group grew 6 millimeters more than those in the placebo group. And one of the reasons that's particularly interesting, of course, is that many of these children who are given stimulant medications lose their appetites and do not grow as optimally. So that was very gratifying to see. Now I'm going to show you how this fits into the other literature. So this is a comparison across all 3 placebo-controlled randomized trials in people who meet the criteria of ADHD. The first one on the far left is Julia Ruckledge's study in adults, and the blue bar shows when they broke the blind that on the clinical global improvement scale, 48% of those who had been getting the real broad spectrum micronutrient formula were in the very much to very much improved range, and only 21% of those who had been on placebo. And then Julia Ruckledge and her colleagues did the trial in the middle of this graph, which was in children, and found roughly similar results. And then just a couple months ago, Dr. Johnstone and her multi-center trial showed also with a broad spectrum formula, when they broke the blind, 54% of the children were in the much to very much improved compared to 18% placebo. When we study these broad spectrum formulas, which are lots of capsules, large capsules, we get very large placebo effects. So this is really, the separation between placebo and active in just 8 weeks with no side effects, no adverse effects. That's really quite good. I would like to end this presentation by giving you not more of those 60 studies which are really replicating the results across lots of centers and are very important, but I'd like to show you a little bit about the human and societal cost of ignoring the importance of nutrition for brain health. So I'm going to review very quickly 2 case studies that I've been involved with. Both of them are published. Here are the references, and I'll tell you about each one. The first one is in a child. So the child had been extremely ill and was an inpatient in mental health with psychosis for 6 months in an excellent center where they knew as much as anyone does about the treatment of psychosis with psychiatric medication. And yet, in spite of people working very hard to make this child healthier, at the age of 10, they could not do so, and he was sent home and moved to outpatient psychiatry. The outpatient psychiatrist, who is the first author of this publication, Dr. Megan Rodway, listened to the parents explain how desperate they were, and since medication had not helped their son, they asked Dr. Rodway if she would let them try micronutrients using one of the multi-nutrient formulas that were developed here in Alberta. And she was very skeptical. She says that what she said to them was, "This is snake oil, but I have nothing better to offer, so why not?" And I was called in to assist with the data. And this is just one slide showing how this boy's hallucinations, both visual and auditory, decreased to 0. He himself was rating those hallucinations, and that's why he could not start rating them the first few weeks because he was too ill to even understand what was happening. But as you can see, he eventually understood, and this is back in 2009. This child continues to be free of psychosis as long as he takes his micronutrients. He has, I believe, an inherited predisposition to need an unusual amount of micronutrients for adequate brain function. He still has some other challenges in life, but he certainly is in much better shape. So what does this mean in terms of the finances involved? We asked a health economist to find out how much it had cost to treat this boy, who we call him Andrew, that's not his real name, to treat Andrew for the 6 months he was an inpatient, and then to compare that to how much it cost in the immediately subsequent 6 months when he was being treated with micronutrients. And as you can see, it costs less than 2% of the conventional and ineffective treatment. The difference is that in our healthcare system in Canada, the conventional treatment is covered by our taxpayers, whereas the micronutrients are not yet covered by any kind of insurance, and so the family has to pay that amount of money. The second case is an adult who, here she is, an adult who we call Marie. In this case, also published with the help of two health economists, we knew that she had many diagnoses, which is typical of adults who are diagnosed with mental health problems. She had lived in three provinces over the years, British Columbia, Ontario, and Alberta. And we knew that after she began the micronutrient formula, she had no longer needed any kind of mental health service. They pulled all the data from the provinces and confirmed those facts, that she had not needed any mental health service since beginning the micronutrients. It's not always that dramatic, by the way, or that simple. And then they took a look at the financial implications. The average annual cost of mental health treatment actually was an underestimate with regard to the conventional treatment. It was more than $60,000 a year. They were only able to capture the inpatient costs, and she had a lot of outpatient visits. At any rate, it was at least $60,000 a year. And then when she changed to nutrients, and also, you know, she this woman we call Marie is very familiar with how we have written up her results, and she wants us always to point out that it enabled her to work harder on getting support from her family and her culture, etc. But the cost of the nutrients is about $760 a year, and she has maintained that good health since 2001. And by the way, again, that $60,000 a year is paid from our healthcare budget, and the $760 is still funded entirely by her because there is no support yet for covering that sort of treatment. So let's talk about what I think the next steps should be. Our government needs to become educated about the role of nutrition. I mean, all of you folks are working so hard to improve our health, the health of our soil, the nutrient density of our crops. The FAO guidelines are the beginning. But in addition, healthier soil will reduce the need for pesticides. Now, I didn't cover any of that, but there is some research showing that, as probably some of you know, that a lot of the minerals are bound by glyphosate and other pesticides, and therefore that is affecting the mineral and vitamin density of our crops. In addition, we need to have education at every level to improve societal knowledge about healthy food choices. It's not all, we can't just blame the soil. We need to pay attention to what we're putting in our mouths, and we need to make sure that it's whole foods and not just ultra-processed chemicals. In my opinion, that education has to begin in elementary school. We should be educating children that vitamins and minerals are the cofactors in brain metabolism. It's not that hard to understand. We should be teaching our doctors that, because I have had many physicians approach me and say that they did not understand the role of minerals and vitamins in providing healthy brain function until they saw things like that tryptophan slide. And finally, the third thing on the slide is that in every health setting, every school, they could all be educating about nutrition and mental health, including the importance of a healthy diet and healthy soil. They could be doing this if we could get the attention of policymakers. And so this is what governments should be working on, in my opinion. My next to last slide, I guess, gives some resources, including 3 important articles that are quite recent. One is mostly for mental health clinicians. Nutrition provides the essential foundation for optimizing mental health, and that's written by the 3 of us who I've mentioned repeatedly now, Julia Ruckledge, Jenny Johnstone, and myself. For people who are particularly interested in ADHD and childhood mood dysregulation, the Maddie trial is cited there. And people who want systematic reviews, Jenny Johnstone, Julia Ruckledge, and their other colleagues published a systematic review last year on multi-nutrients for the treatment of psychiatric symptoms. And finally, this is really important. If you're not familiar with MOOCs, you can go to edX.org. A MOOC is a mass online open course. And if you search for Routledge or search for mental health and nutrition, you can, at no cost and at your own speed, have a very entertaining course with videotaped interviews and all the information that I've been covering here and more. So I highly recommend that to you. It's actually one of the 100 most visited MOOCs in the last year out of, I think, about 3,000. It's been very, very popular around the world, and I highly recommend it to you. And finally, I'll just end with a picture of my own book again, but more importantly, my website. You can email me there. You can find out about the book. You can watch other videos, etc. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions, since we cannot do a Q&A in this format. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Dr. KAPLAN. Thank you for the inspiration. It's now up to all of us to implement your work and influence the change in society that we all need. For more information about soil health, composting, organics recycling, and the return of the valuable organic matter that is the responsibility of each of us, please visit our website and become involved in our work. Compost.org, the Compost Council of Canada, thanks you for your involvement and looks forward to you continuing to move forward in the world, making a difference each and every day.